Hey everyone, we're at Grayfords. We're here to meet a friend of the show, Andrienne Kennedy, and she's a vintage clothing collector who got her start working out of a costume house in New York. Now, Grayfords, Whitney?
Grayfords is an antique and vintage store in the heart of Montclair, New Jersey.
Vintage, that's what I wanted to ask you about, the definition of vintage, right? Because I know vintage clothing could be considered maybe that 1950s old school leather jacket that we might have seen Marlon Brando wear in a movie. But what's the real, for someone like me who doesn't know anything, right? What's the definition of vintage, collectible, and memorabilia?
Okay, Eric, so this is where people often get confused. Antiques have to be at least 100 years old. So right now we're in 1920, 1921. Vintage has to be around 20 years old. Now you know the vintage market is huge right now in retail, and designers and designs are running that market. Now collectibles, you know, like collectors love the hunt, and they usually keep their collections. Now this is where memorabilia come in. Memorabilia is just part of collections, and it represents a memorable place or a memorable person.
I see. Hey Andrienne.
Right?
Hi guys.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
So we know that you're in your element here in this store in Grayfords. So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started collecting.
Well, about 20 years ago, I worked in a costume house, so that really sparked my interest into collecting. I've always been into fashion, but this experience just sparked my interest even more.
In terms of clothing, what's the vintage for you? I know you were talking earlier about vintage, what makes vintage so, is there kind of
A line you won't cross?
Everybody has their preferences. I stay away from things that are like, you know, 1800s, 1900s. That's just not my personal cup of tea. Although I do find the beauty in it, and I see why people use those types of items as inspiration. Because that's just not personally my cup of tea.
I see. So you go back as far, where's your beginning point in terms of vintage clothing or clothing that you consider?
I would say probably around the 60s.
Since you both have been doing collecting and vintage clothing and collectibles, do you find that more African Americans are picking up this hobby or interest?
I would say 20 years ago, not so much, but because vintage has become so in style now, that's all the rage, I see a lot more people of color into vintage, a lot more people of color collecting.
I see.
Now, Eric, I would say that a lot of the African American memorabilia is coming out of collections, and African Americans are trying to now buy pieces.
I see. So would you say they're realizing the value of
I think
family
we've
heirlooms?
always been interested in our history and trying to recapture it. So now that there are certain things from slavery and from 1920s and the war, people are trying to gather it up.
I see.
I have one more question.
Yes.
So how are the young people wearing vintage clothing now?
So what I think the young people are doing is that they are expressing themselves through their clothing. You know, a lot of the designers are charging lots of money for things, and the younger people may not be able to afford those things. So they're going to the vintage shops and making things their own, like this jacket, for instance. They would maybe style it up with a pair of baggy jeans and a pair of Vans or a pair of Converse and a white t-shirt, and it's cool, it's fun, and it's vintage.
Right.
So are you guys trying to say I can make a lot of money selling my old 1980s wardrobe items?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, classic t-shirts are really in right now.
Classic t-shirts, okay, as opposed to wearing the whole outfit.
Not a good idea for someone our age.
All right, thanks, Whitney. I'm glad you put me in your age category. Thank you very much.